wanted to do is to talk about this model of stress and coping, and it was really useful to me to understand this model. And there are two researchers, McCubbin and also Patterson, and they've done work at the University of Minnesota and developed actually a very nice empirically supported model that helps explain about coping. And sometimes people who write dissertations like myself decide they never want to see that material ever again because they had to live in it for so long. And I used this theory in my dissertation, and I've really hung on to it for 20-something years because it's been so proven to be so true in clinical work and other work that I do. So basically, the nutshell version of their theory is that the resources that a person has, their pileup of demands, and their perceptions, all of those things that they've got going for them, if you will, before a crisis, predict how well they will respond to a crisis. Okay? So when we're thinking about people going through a trauma, part of this explains why some people do better in response to it than others, because resources, regardless of what they are, and resources doesn't necessarily mean money. It might mean that they have friends, that they have family support, that they have good coping skills, that they are intelligent. I mean, all of those things could be resources. So the resources, the pileup of demands piece of this is what other things do you have going on in your life when a crisis arises? So that means, like, well, did you just go through a divorce? Did you just get in a car accident? Did you just lose your job? All kinds of, did your kid get thrown in jail? Whatever. All kinds of problems that happen create a pileup of demands that minimizes one's ability to cope with some crisis that comes along the way. And then the third aspect of this theory is perceptions. And that is, what meaning are you making out of your circumstances? What story do you tell yourself about your life and how things are going, and how do you perceive what's happening around you? It's bigger than is the glass half empty or half full, but it has to do with what story are you telling yourself about this. So all of that predicts how people cope with crisis. Once the crisis occurs, the McCubbins say same thing. These same three elements are related to how people adapt to a crisis. So a crisis occurs, and adaptation is based on what are the person's resources, what pileup of demands do they have, and how are they interpreting this crisis. Okay? And so I think that it helps us too, as we're thinking about dealing with them and thinking about managing our own stress in the work we do. These elements are important. Yeah.
There's a passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, where you can substitute for the word temptation. It can be stress, it can be divorce, it can be whatever. It says, no temptation has seized you except what is common to man. So, we may not all have the same problems, but the problems are pretty universal. Mm-hmm. So no temptation has seized you except what is common to man. God is faithful. That's the promise. Mm-hmm. God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, He will provide you with a way to stand up under it. And that's what you're getting to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's sort of some ways to be intentional about managing whatever does come your way. So what I found in my dissertation, the study I did, and it's been a long time ago now, but I was interested in looking at United Methodist clergy, because in that polity, they get sent to their assignments. And so I thought, wow, how do people deal with that? because I was still early on in my experience of it, and it was difficult. And so I thought, well, maybe there's something wrong with me, or is there some systemic thing about multiple relocations that are outside of your control? How does that wear on a person? And so I did this quantitative statistical study, and I found that there wasn't any difference between people that moved a lot and people who didn't. And so I was really kind of upset because I wanted it to be that the people who moved a lot were not doing so well. But it didn't turn out that way. But I used this theory, and the thing that was so helpful to me was that it all turned on their perceptions. So, and this is kind of where you're coming from, was that there was a write-in piece, not just numbers, but there was a qualitative invitation that said, tell me something about your relocation experience, very open. And so the perceptions that made the difference were people said, well, I see my work and these relocations as a call from God. And so because I see it that way, yes, I've lived in awful houses and been in churches that couldn't pay my salary and other kinds of problems, but I had a larger perception. I had a belief system. I told myself a story about this experience that helped me cope with it. And that was the turning point, is that it wasn't about external factors. It was about people's resources and their pileup of demands, but the key factor was their perceptions. What did people believe about their circumstances? And if they told themselves that this is the worst thing and that they were just always being punished and that, you know, the system had it out for them, whatever, their adjustment wasn't nearly as good as the people even the people who said, I made my bed, I have to lie in it, which is kind of a depressed commentary. Even they were doing better than the ones who were blaming external sources. So it's kind of like, here's a place where our faith comes in, is that, you know, your point about I can only do so much and then I have to lean on spiritual power, that's a belief, that's a sustaining kind of belief that keeps you from saying I have to do it all. And so that's what I'm thinking is really helpful for us, is that the level of adaptation is based on these three factors. And so it makes sense when we're thinking about others we're working with, or when we're thinking about ourselves coping with our jobs and our volunteer work and our caregiving, is how do I cope with this? I need to increase my resources, reduce my pileup of demands, and change my perceptions. Okay then, so it's all in a little box, and it's much harder to do than it is to say. Yeah.
Yeah. The only thing I don't want to throw a monkey wrench or go on to it.
Oh, throw a monkey wrench.
Sometimes I was looking through the things, and it was like one of the phases you start to think of things as being incompetent or ignorant. I was thinking, what if that's actually true? What if you actually are in a system which is set up so that, and I'm thinking specifically of nursing. The last time I was in an institutional setting, the patient load was ludicrous.
Right.
You could not do, I used to say, you know, the type of nursing I was taught 30 years ago compared to the type of nursing I have today is a difference between old McDonald's farm and one of those factory farms where they just put the animals in a pen and they never get out, and
right.
they just stuff them full of stuff and then slaughter. And that it's kind of like factory nursing. And sometimes the system is the problem. It's not your perceptions. It's not that, you know, you've got so much going on in your life, or it's just literally that the job is impossible to do. I mean, the only thing I can see in that case is sometimes maybe the story of your life is, well, I'm going to be the person who's going to change this and go into full-blown whistleblower reform mode, but that's going to be taxing too.
That's true. Well, and I think your point's well taken, is that perceptions, changing one's perceptions doesn't necessarily change the facts, of, yes, there are people who are incompetent, there are people who are inappropriate, and there are systems that are oppressive. We know those things. Part of the resources piece is how do we gather resources to address this, and how do we make choices about whether this is the best system for us to be in. I mean, there's a lot of helping to be done, and sometimes certain organizations and certain institutions are so oppressive and energy sapping that they make their mission impossible. So your point's really well taken.
We do get to choose where we are.
We do
have freedom of choice.
And, you know, she's saying, well, we do get to choose. And one of the things that, being a therapist, that's one of the things that I have to deal with all the time, is the idea that people are trapped in their circumstances and don't see alternatives. And when we say something about, well, you can choose, and I used to say that to my son who didn't want to go to school. Well, you don't have to go. You do have to accept the consequences of not going. And here's what the home front ones are going to be. And then there'll be some more at the school. And most of the time we don't really like the idea that we have that much choice. We like to say, well, I have to do this. Well, do you? Well, I do if I want to put food on the table. Do I have to do this? Well, not necessarily. So it's a good thing to remember that we do have some choice, and we have some choice about how we construe what we're doing.
Sometimes, though, when people are going through these types of situations and become so debilitated through compassion fatigue, it's very hard to see that there are any options. Feel trapped or at the bottom of the well.
Right.
And, that can be, it's for an outsider looking in, you think, well, you have these options and try this, but that's why I think it's important to have a nurturing group around you to try to help you. At our last program that we had, it was kind of like an emergency session for the kids, and it was really apparent that so many people down here were running on a kind of emptiness, and in some cases that a hostile work environment had been created, maybe not intentionally created, but sometimes the upper management or the over management, they are feeling so much pressure. I'm not trying to defend that really, but I'm saying that there's so much pressure and so little regard for the emotional condition of humanity and the spiritual condition of humanity, that not enough of the big picture comes into play in our society.
Yeah, and I don't think that we can make excuses for systems in any way, but one of the resources piece is just like what we're doing today, is creating more community among people who are about similar missions, and building connections, and having the resource of other people that we can rely on for support, not just family support or our own friendship networks, but also other people that are involved in this kind of work that is required. And we hope that we're not going to get so far down the well that we can't climb out, or that we can't get replenished in a way that we need to and stay that way.